what is very clear is that when Putin is with Trump, Trump feels that, he's not the alpha in the room, which is quite interesting. So I don't believe that Trump will ever impose sanctions on Russia, and he's not even imposing tariffs.
Volodymyr Zelensky called an overnight strike on government hub in Kyiv a ruthless attack and has promised to deliver an appropriate response. Russian drones and missiles were sent towards the Cabinet of Ministers building in what's believed to be the biggest assault of the war so far. Sir Keir Starmer's called the attacks brutal and appalling and says that Vladimir Putin is not serious about peace. In the US, President Trump vowed to not so long ago that he'd end the war in Ukraine at a moment's notice. Here's what he said at a press conference in the Oval Office not so long ago.
I thought it was going to be probably one of the easier ones, and that's with President Putin and Ukraine. And that turned out to be one that's a little bit more difficult. But the 7 are done. They were supposed to be much more difficult to solve. I solved every one of them. And we're going to get the other one done, too. But it turned out to be a little bit more difficult than I thought. And it'll get done or they'll be held to pay.
So how does Ukraine respond to the latest attacks? And is there any end to the war in sight? Let's discuss this with Arthur Snell, author, political commentator and former British diplomat. Arthur, good afternoon. Thanks for giving us your time.
Good afternoon.
This latest escalation, what does that tell us about the mindset, particularly of Vladimir Putin?
Well, I think what it reminds us is that the Trump plan for ending the war was to give Putin what he wanted, which was an offer of, the land in the Donbass that he's already seized, plus the possibility of even more land. And Trump has never for a moment thought that there's been any sort of Ukrainian side to this argument. And the challenge is that Ukraine is standing its ground, which is its right to do, and it's doing it with the backing of European governments, including our own. And I think, we can all be proud of the role that's being played by European governments. And so Putin is seeing that he isn't going to be gifted victory on a plate. And so he's just escalating and escalating. And if you like, crossing certain taboos, like targeting that government building.
We expect there to be a retaliation from what we heard from President Zelensky. Does this simply just knock any chance of peace talks just into the long grass?
I mean, I think we had to be realistic that the peace talks were always a rather faint hope, because Trump's idea of peace talks was you put Zelensky in a room and say, you're not going to win this war, hand over a third of your territory to the Russians, and be happy that that's what we're giving you. And at the same time, Trump wasn't prepared to invest serious military resources in securing a peace. I mean, ultimately, Trump doesn't understand, how peace processes work. So there's this whole idea of the coalition of the willing, with France and the UK and so on. But it's really the coalition of the unwilling. Trump is unwilling to secure the peace that he claims he is sort of arguing towards. So, yeah, I mean, it's depressing as it is. Ukraine has to keep fighting, because if it doesn't, it will see its capital city bombarded by Russia. It will see its people treated in the most horrific manner in the occupied territories, and it will see Russia continuing to try to advance. Now, the only thing I would note, which is perhaps a cause for some optimism, is that Russia itself is proving almost incapable of any advance. It's inching forwards at a snail's pace and at the loss of staggering numbers of its own troops.
Arthur, I don't want to read too much into this, but is this latest Russian attack perhaps been emboldened by those meetings that we witnessed last weekend, where we saw President Xi, Vladimir Putin, we saw the head of the Indian government, all together, this coalition, the anti-NATO coalition it's been called, even though it was attended by Turkey, who is a NATO member. But is Vladimir Putin been emboldened from that show of solidarity between those leaders?
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. You're not reading too much. I think it's a correct reading, because what Putin got was two things. He got the chance to spend more time with Kim Jong-un of North Korea, who, of course, has put tens of thousands of his troops into the field in Ukraine, and a large number of them have been killed, but that probably doesn't matter if you're the leader of North Korea. Plus, he gets the chance to interact with Xi Jinping, who is his main economic partner. Of course, China is doing very well from buying cut price oil and gas off the Russians, and the Russians are getting huge numbers of components for their weapons, not weapons themselves, but components for weapons from China. So it would be very surprising if Putin hadn't left that very sort of impressive summit. You have to acknowledge that without feeling a bit more sort of steel in his spine.
Now, President Trump had threatened to impose severe sanctions on Russia. That was then averted by that meeting in Alaska. Has there been any talk, or do you think we might see Donald Trump go ahead with those sanctions on Russia? We know that he puts heavy sanctions on India for buying Russian oil, but can we expect any sort of tightening or pressure? It feels like ever since that Alaska weekend passed, the issue has sort of gone away.
Yeah, and I think you have to you judge people by their actions. Trump talks tough now and then on Russia. Not, most of the time he seems to talk quite favorably about Russia and about Putin, but now and then he'll sort of lose his temper. And I think when Trump made those statements prior to the Alaska meeting, I think it was because he felt embarrassed. He felt that that to some extent people around the world were sort of slightly laughing at his idea of peace when Putin continued to escalate his attacks on Ukraine. But then what happened is that he meets Putin in Alaska, literally rolls out the red carpet, applauds him as he comes through, gives Putin the first chance to speak at the press conference. Obviously, lots of people speculate about the relationship between Trump and Putin. But what is very clear is that when Putin is with Trump, Trump feels that, he's not the alpha in the room, which is quite interesting. So I don't believe that Trump will ever impose sanctions on Russia. And he's not even imposing tariffs. I mean, let's not forget that even with all the negotiation and hard work of Keir Starmer, we still got tariffs as the UK. Switzerland has got nearly 40% tariffs. India, as you mentioned there, Russia, nothing. So, I mean, I think that, like I say, if you judge from the actions, I think Trump is incapable of standing up to Russia. And really, the question is why that might be.
And just finally, Arthur, this meeting that was hailed as the piece of progress that's come out of that Alaskan meeting weekend, followed, of course, by the heads of many European countries traveling to the White House on that Monday. So is anybody still pursuing this meeting? Will this meeting between at least Presidents Putin and Zelensky, do you think that's got any chance of going ahead?
I think a very low chance, because basically Putin doesn't want to meet Zelensky because Putin doesn't believe that Ukraine is a real country. So by meeting its president, he's granting them a level of credibility that he doesn't want to grant them. The only context in which he would meet Zelensky would be a context in which Zelensky had been forced into the surrender deal that Trump was trying to force on him. So I don't see that as coming, because I think, thankfully, thanks to the support of European allies, Zelensky has been able to stand firm and continue fighting for a free Ukraine.
Arthur, thank you for giving us your time. Arthur Snell, their author, political commentator and former British diplomat.